exclusively on Secular Media Network. This is the Gaytheist Manifesto.
Hello and welcome to the Gaytheist Manifesto, your source for news, commentary, discussion, and debate at the intersection of the atheist movement and the LGBT rights movement. I am your host, Callie Wright, and this week we are having a discussion about trans people who identify as non-binary. And basically what that means, very simply, is that there are those of us who identify as male, and there are those of us who identify as female, and there are those of us who identify as neither. Non-binary is a umbrella term that covers many different sorts of identities across a very wide spectrum with a wide variety of labels attached to them that all mean different things to the folks that that choose those labels, and that's all cool. There are lots of pronouns involved, and I think it's an important discussion to have because oftentimes, even within the trans community, I feel like non-binary people sometimes get excluded by those of us binary identified folks, and I think that is not even a little bit okay because, we hate it when society does it to us. We shouldn't be doing it to folks in our community is kind of what it comes down to. So I've asked two of good friends of mine to come onto the show to discuss their personal experiences and how they navigate the world as non-binary identified trans folks. Same two folks from the last episode. It's almost as if we're recording it the same night.
Almost.
First, we have friend of the show, personal friend, and all-around badass. I'm just going to introduce you like that from now on, anytime you're on the show, Ari.
Works
So
for
just
me.
so you know how that works. Ari Coleman, welcome to the show.
Hello, and since we are totally recording on the same time as the last one, squeaky voice still applies. So there we go.
Right, understood. You are
Yes.
forgiven. And we also have host of the By Any Means podcast, Trav Mamone. Welcome, Trav.
Hello. Hopefully your audience won't get too sick of me.
Yeah, this is 3 shows in a row for you.
Dang, new record.
Right? Yeah. So,
What can I say? I like to spread the love all over.
Oh.
Well,
I just remember. Oh, God. That sounded a lot better in my head.
well, this episode took exactly 2 minutes and 26 seconds to go downhill. All right. Well, so basically what I'd kind of like to focus on in the discussion, I feel like folks who listen to the show probably, at least they should, have a pretty decent idea of some of the struggles that binary identified trans folks like me or like my friend Will, who was on the show before, experience in our day-to-day lives. So I'd kind of like to focus on, obviously there's intersectionality between all of it, but I'd like to focus on some of the unique issues that non-binary identified trans folks face, namely the perception of, and I almost want to title this episode Not Trans Enough, which I might. But there's this idea in the trans community a lot of times that someone, you're supposed to be male or female, and you have to be enough of either of those things for your identity to be valid. And I feel like just from things that I've seen and things that I've heard from folks that pressure seems to be ratcheted down even harder on folks who identify as non-binary. It's almost kind of the same thing that bisexual people hear. Well, you just got to pick one, or you're just confused and really, really stupid stuff like that. So Ari, does that kind of map to your experience?
Yeah, definitely. It's surprising the amount of ignorance there is, not only among cisgender people, but among binary trans people as well. There are a lot of binary, not a lot maybe, definitely it's getting better in this area as time goes on and people get exposed to different types of people and just learn more about, other types of people than themselves. I think a lot of trans people, these specific binary trans people that I'm talking about, they kind of feel a little bit threatened whenever somebody identifies as trans but doesn't identify as binary, because they feel like, especially if you're a trans woman, like, it's not easy for you. It's not, definitely. It's difficult, coming out and transitioning, and you get a lot of, bad comments and threats of violence sometimes. And I think they feel like the non-binary trans people are kind of skirting that because they can still kind of pass for cis if they want to. But that just kind of ignores there's just a whole big, huge spectrum of non-binary people. There are people who change their name and pronouns from what they were given at birth. There are people who want medical transition. There are people who don't want any medical transition. There are people who want to take hormones but don't want any surgeries. There are people who continue to wear the same clothes that they wore their whole life, and people that radically change their style of dress when they decide to come out. So there's just a huge variance of people, and it's unfortunate that people don't understand and support us all the time. I feel like they should understand more, because binary trans people get people questioning their gender all the time, and then a lot of them, again, not a lot, but some, turn around and then do the same thing to non-binary people as well, which is frustrating. Yeah,
it's frustrating for me to see it, and I mean, obviously, it's got to be even more frustrating to deal with it. I mean, one of the things that I said in the talk that I gave on compassion, where I was talking about how I've seen members of my own community, the transgender community here in Cincinnati, be super derisive towards even the idea of non-binary people. And I just think to myself, like, if you can accept the basic idea that, the M or the F on your birth certificate isn't the final say, it would seem to me logical that you could extrapolate that to, well, there is a very large and varied spectrum of ways that you don't fit into those boxes. You know what I mean? It doesn't even make sense in my head to think that, well, the only thing that you can do is switch boxes.
Right.
So it blows my mind that it's because, I was ignorant of the concept largely until I got to know people who identified that way. But when they explained it to me, it's like, oh, okay, well, yeah, I guess that totally makes sense. Get it. Trav, talk a little bit about your experience with that whole thing, if you could.
I've only experienced very little of what Ari was talking about, trans people, binary trans people saying you're not trans enough. There was one time when I was just starting to understand being genderqueer. There's a certain group of people that are known as true scum, which that might be a slur.
Oh, they're wonderful.
Oh, yeah. They say that, you're not truly trans unless you have dysphoria, which I'm not quite sure if they mean just bodily dysphoria or any sort of dysphoria, because...
Well, right, because social dysphoria is definitely a thing, too.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I have social dysphoria more than bodily dysphoria.
I do as well.
And if we can, for a second... talk about social dysphoria, because I don't know. I've probably talked about a lot of things that fall under the umbrella of social dysphoria on the show, but I don't know that I've ever actually named it. So talk a little bit about that. Obviously, when we talk about, body dysphoria, it's the discomfort we feel when our bodies don't match the neural map that our brain has for them. But social dysphoria is kind of an entirely different concept. So if you could just explain that for a minute.
Right. Well, basically, it's sort of like if you're a cisgender man, but everyone keeps calling you a girl. That's the best way I can sort of describe a social dysphoria. I actually have a little bit of perhaps a better illustration of it, and this one comes from real life. Say, for example, a friend invites me over to their house for, I don't know, a 4th of July cookout or their kid's birthday party. And when I get there, the men say, "Hey, Trav, come help us move this really heavy object." And being someone who is young and able-bodied, and with my anatomy, it does have higher muscle mass than people with a different anatomy, I have no problem helping them out. And then afterwards, I help them move the heavy thing. And then we all get to chatting and have beers, and they're all talking about guy things, whether it's, house repairs or sports or, how crazy women are. And I'm just like, I got these shoes yesterday from Target. Aren't they cute? And they look at me like, yes, very cute. I'm like, okay, this is awkward. I'm going to go hang out with the women now. And so I go over to where all the women are, and they immediately say, "Oh, Trav, you look so pretty today." I'm like, "Oh, thank you. Wow, I feel like I totally fit in now." And then we get to chatting, and eventually the conversation leads to the women complaining about how the dumb stuff their husbands do, and one of them will say, men just don't listen." Oh, no offense, Trav. Taken, I guess. Oh, screw it. I'm going to go play with the dogs. That's the best way I can describe it. That's such an accurate
description of my life. I can't even believe it.
Yeah, well, and I would guess that obviously that'd be especially jarring, because I've kind of had those experiences where, I have a lot of guy friends, and it's leftover. This is going to sound terrible. I don't want to say it's like leftover from pre-transition. I love them all very much. They are all very dear friends of mine, and they've supported me a lot through everything that I've been through. I don't know that I would have had as many guy friends if I didn't, pretend to be a guy for so long. And it's weird how that socialization dynamic kind of changes a little bit. And I'm hanging out with my guy friends because they're my guy friends and I've known them for like 10 years. But like I hear the wives in the other room having the conversation, and I kind of want to hang out with them. So then, I can imagine extrapolating from that, like not being entirely comfortable in either space. I think that can cause a little bit of extra problems there. So let's talk about pronouns for a second.
A fun topic.
Right. I really, I need to start writing this into the run sheet for my show, because I've told this story on the show before, and the thing with pronouns has actually been kind of a journey for me, and recognizing my own privilege as a binary identified trans person, right? And trans people are generally way more used to talking about ways in which we are not privileged than ways that we are. But being identified, binary identified, is a privilege that I have, and I recognize that. But I remember one time when I went to a support group meeting and everyone introduced themselves with names and pronouns. And I went along with it because that's what the group was doing. But in my head, what I'm thinking is, I've fought really hard to be recognized as the gender that I am. And when someone assumes my gender and assumes correctly, that's an incredibly validating experience for me. But the leap that I took is realizing that because we live in a binary society, or mostly people who see things in that way, for a person who is non-binary or genderqueer or anywhere, who identifies anywhere in between on that spectrum, someone is likely to never assume they're genderqueer and use gender-neutral pronouns, because that's not the society that we live in. So knowing that, it makes sense to me, well, when we write our names on name tags, why don't we write our pronouns? Sure.
That's what I do.
When we introduce ourselves, why don't we introduce ourselves with our pronouns, or, that kind of thing. So, Ari, do you want to talk a little bit about your experience with you having to kind of assert yourself with your pronouns after coming out?
Yeah, it's difficult for people, and I don't blame anyone at all for messing up my pronouns, which are they, them, theirs, by the way, because speaking the English language, we all grow up with he, she, him, or she, her, hers. That's it. Those are the only options. So, it doesn't surprise me that people would never assume my pronouns correctly in the first place, which is why I think it's a great idea to, tell people your pronouns. And it is difficult, especially with people who knew you before you came out or before any kind of transition that you're doing, because they do automatically want to use the pronouns that they used before. And sometimes you just have to say, just like, oh, by the way, it's they, not she or he or whatever it is that you had before. Yeah, I mean, I still have a way to go with getting some people on board, not because they're being disrespectful or because they're purposefully not using the correct pronouns, but because they're just not trained that way. English is not a good language to be, neutral in. And I think it's even worse for people who don't use they, them, theirs pronouns, because those are still standard pronouns in English. There are also tons of other pronouns out there that are not standard pronouns that people probably haven't even heard of before somebody says these are my pronouns. So really, you just need to, if you're an ally to a trans person who has a non-binary or neutral pronoun, just practice. That's all we're asking. We're not asking for you to be perfect 100% of the time. We're asking for you to try your best and just to practice and get in the habit of it. Because like Trav was talking about before, it's like when if you are like a big burly man and someone calls you she all the time, it just feels weird. It feels wrong. It's the exact same kind of thing.
Well, so then let me ask this, because, obviously, we live in a society where most folks assume that a person is either a he or a her. And, where do you draw the line at correcting people? For example, like if, you're going through a checkout line and someone ma'ams you or sirs you, which neither is technically correct, how do you respond to that? I mean, like, me, for example, I don't have the most feminine voice. I work in a call center. When someone misgenders me because I'm having a 10-minute relationship with that person, generally speaking, I don't care. I just let it go because it's not worth the effort. But, people who see me in person, I have a very feminine presentation, so people can kind of assume that about me without me having to introduce myself. Hi, my name's Callie, she, her, hers. So how do you navigate that when, say, coworkers, for example, or, if you're going to buy a TV, a salesperson, like situations like that, like where do you draw the line where you just like kind of cringe and it's not worth the effort versus like, no, I'm going to correct you and you're going to get this right?
For me personally, it's pretty much entirely the former, especially with people I don't know, just because like they're not trying to be rude to me. They just don't know. And it's like, I don't know them. So it's not like they're trying to do a personal slight. They just don't know. And it's not really, to me, it's not worth the effort. To other people, because, pronouns are a big deal, but they're not like a huge deal to me. Like I won't like cry if you use the wrong pronoun just because I'm so used to it for my whole life. But, it really just, for me, comes down to intent. If it's an honest mistake and they have no idea, they might not even know that non-binary is a thing, which most people in the world don't. So I don't blame them for that. But if it's someone in my life who knows what my pronouns are and they're intentionally using incorrect pronouns, that is where I would draw the line and say, it's actually they, it's not she.
Gotcha. Trav, what about you?
Oh, I was basically going to say the same thing Ari said. If somebody's, checks me out at Target, and says, have a good day, sir, I don't say, no, don't call me sir or ma'am or something like that. I usually don't bother because they don't know me from Adam or Eve, whichever you want to
right.
pick there. So, and I don't want to get into the whole genderqueer 101 discussion with them, but like Ari said, if it's somebody that I know, excuse me, and they still call me he, I'm like, it's actually they. I actually had a little bit of a huge debate on Facebook not too long ago about the they, them pronouns, because those are my preferred pronouns as well. But everyone was like, oh, it feels so weird calling one person.
Correct.
Right. So finally I said, okay, screw it. Just call me, use Z here pronouns for me from now on. How's that?
And how was
See,
that
makes it any better?
And how was that received? I'm sure they were 100% okay with it, right?
I think I posted up a conjugation chart to let them know how it works.
That's fantastic. Because I know for me, in any interaction at this point, basically any interaction outside of like a 2-minute phone conversation, like I called somebody for a part for my car today and they served me and it was like, mildly annoying. And when it happens to me on the phones at work, like I said, it's not worth that getting that worked up over. But, you know, when people use the wrong pronouns for me, I mean, it's anywhere from like cheese grater on my skin to like completely emotionally devastating, which is, you know, maybe that's an outsized reaction. Maybe I need to work on that a little bit, but I just, it's tough for me to imagine having to accept that I'm going to be misgendered basically by everyone who doesn't know me.
Now, let me ask you this. If like a friend says, you know, yeah, my friend Callie, she, well, does that bother you? Or if it's just a one-time thing, you let it slide? Or how do you feel about that?
I mean, if they correct themselves, it's definitely not a thing that I'm like, it's nothing that I get mad about. Because obviously, you know, like we said, people are going to slip up, especially people, right. You know, people who've known me for 10 or 15 years and we're 2 years into me being Callie. Like, obviously, you know, I can't expect everyone. I mean, even 2 years in, I think it's a little much to expect perfection in that way, especially from people who have known me for most of my life. So yeah, I mean, if they correct themselves and so, I'm not going to pretend like it doesn't bother me a little bit because it does. But I recognize that it's not purposeful and I'm able to just kind of let it go.
Okay.
Was that not the answer you were expecting?
No. That is the answer I was expecting.
Okay.
Sounded a little perplexed.
Yeah,
no, that's how I'm naturally a listener more than a talker. So when people say something, I just go, cool.
Gotcha. Okay. So another thing that I'd like to talk about is the dirty word that explodes comment sections and destroys lives all over the world, and that word is privilege. So what I would be interested in is learning in what ways have you seen, if any, yourselves navigating privilege differently since, you know, social or physical or any sort of transition or coming out period. Has that dynamic changed for either of you? Trav, we'll start with you.
Well, you know, it's people still read me as a man, even if I wear candy apple colored lip butter and I paint my nails. You know, I still get read as a guy, so I don't know. Maybe I still. Then again, it goes back to the old question: can a trans femme person have male privilege? You know, but
well, right. That's kind of what I was getting at. Is, you know. Do you get? I mean, do you notice yourself being treated more like that stereotypical, like, you know, the redneck is like, oh, that freaking queer, you know, like, I mean, do you get more reactions to that as opposed to like if you're presenting more stereotypically masculinely? Is that a thing, or am I like way off base even with the question? I don't know.
No, you're not off base. Where I live on Maryland's Eastern Shore region, when it comes to LGBT rights and LGBT people, it's I'm okay with it as long as I don't have to see it. Don't ask, don't tell. And so I might get like some old people kind of look at me funny, and part of me is thinking, that's right, bitch, say it to my face. But another part of me is like, please don't say anything.
Right. What about you, Ari? Have you noticed yourself navigating privilege any differently? Or
I still feel fairly privileged as a trans person goes, just because I'm trans masculine and not trans feminine. You know, trans feminine people tend to get a lot more, you know, interesting bad things happening to them. Well, for example, I always wear pants or shorts. I never ever wear skirts or dresses. That's just how I like to dress. And for someone who is read as female all the time, that's not a problem whatsoever. There are tons of people all the time who are wearing, pants and shorts and not skirts or dresses. Whereas, if I were, for example, in Trav's case, if I were wearing a dress or something, I would definitely feel a little uneasy with that, just because of all of the, the trans misogyny that goes on and the misogyny in general that goes on. But yeah, I'm fairly early on in, I guess you would call it medical transition. I started testosterone about a month and a half ago, and I haven't had changes enough to where I'm being read as male at all. That's definitely going to take several more months for that to happen. I'm hoping to get into kind of a middle place where people can't really assume whether I was assigned male or female at birth. So I'm prepared for kind of weird questions like, are you a boy or a girl?
What are you?
Yeah, what is up with your whole deal? So, yeah, but at the moment I get read as female pretty much 100% of the time, which is going to be fun because there's a certain person at work, one of our accounts, who calls in and specifically wants to talk to me because I'm female and flirts with me.
Whoops.
And yeah, he's interesting. So I'm just laughing in my head, like my voice is starting to break and it's going to get lower and he is going to be so confused and I'm going to be so happy.
Oh man, that's amazing. I've joked sometimes because I've heard, this hasn't happened to me, but folks that I work with have told me that women that I work with have told me that people have actually said, like, I want to speak to a male representative because you obviously don't know what you're doing. And I just thought to myself, like, God, if that ever happens to me, because like I know that I don't have the most feminine voice in the world, but if you heard what I used to sound like, I used to be like ultra crazy baritone. And so like if that ever happens to me, I'm literally like, okay, I'll just put them on hold for a second and just come back like, yes. Oh man, that's interesting. Yeah, a lot of I always kind of joke with people who have just come out. I say, like, transitioning, whatever your identity is and whatever your end goal is, I think so often being trans and transitioning is this exercise in thinking about things that you never in a million years thought that you would have to consider, like the idea of misogyny validating your gender identity. Because that's definitely happened to me.
Oh yeah, I've had transphobia validate my gender identity. Somebody, I was arguing with somebody on a thread who was just doing the typical transphobic stuff, and apparently he thought that I was assigned male at birth from my profile picture. So I was like, oh my gosh, I'm so androgynous, he can't even tell how I was assigned at birth. Extra win for me.
Oh, that is hilarious.
I loved it.
Oh man. Yeah, and I've had a couple of times where I want to tell the story as vaguely as possible because it's kind of a personal situation, but we'll just say that somebody was mad, and the reason that they were mad was because I was a woman.
Okay, I think I see what you're getting there.
Yeah. Well, let me turn it on both of you for a minute. Ari, we'll start with you. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you think is important? Because I think, there are probably a lot of ways in which I don't even have the perspective to ask the right questions. And I always think it's important in a situation like that to kind of turn around and be like, well, why don't you ask yourself a question and then answer it as, something that's important for folks to know that I might not even have thought to ask about.
I would just say that being non-binary is not the same as being androgynous, especially in your presentation. Like I was talking about before, there are a whole different host of ways to be non-binary, and I feel like almost everyone experiences their gender in a different way, including binary people and cis people as well. I was just thinking, like, on the whole transition topic, I'm taking testosterone to have a more androgynous appearance, and I hope in the future to have top surgery to remove my breasts. But this is not a thing that is standard necessarily amongst non-binary people. There are non-binary people out there who don't have any qualms whatsoever about their physical body. They just would prefer people to see them in a different way than they're currently seeing them. There are also non-binary people who, for example, if they were assigned female at birth, will transition in all the traditional ways to being male. They'll have all the different surgeries and procedures and hormones, and they might even use he, him, his pronouns, but they still consider themselves non-binary because their body doesn't necessarily link to their own internal sense of their gender. So I think it's just important to keep in mind that there are, again, so many different ways. There are people who don't medically or socially transition at all. There are people who medically and socially transition as far as you can get from how they were assigned at birth, and they're all still non-binary. Just listen to people on what they say their gender is. Yeah, well,
and I think that's an important point because, you know, one of the arguments that we talk about with trans people in general is that, you know, what's in your head and what's, you know, what your body is and what your outward presentation is, all of those things aren't necessarily tied to each other in any specific way. Sometimes they are. Sometimes people feel female, are stereotypically female-bodied, assigned female at birth, and are completely comfortable with all things femme. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But there's a whole spectrum in between of, you know, presentation and physical makeup and psychological identity and all of those kind of things. And, you know, if I'm making that argument for myself as a binary identified trans person saying, you know, I was assigned male at birth. I have what people typically refer to as a male body. Well, not so much anymore post hormones in certain ways, but you know what I mean. Typically what you associate with male anatomy. And if I can assert that despite that, I identify as female, I don't understand why people can't say, despite being assigned female at birth, despite being assigned male at birth, I'm not comfortable with that, and I'm not comfortable with the other side of the binary either. Right. I don't understand why that doesn't make sense to people. So Trav, what do you think?
Well, I think it is because we live in a world that sees, first of all, we live in a society that equates genitals with gender, and second of all, most of the transgender people that cis people have met, whether in real life or maybe seen on television, are binary transgender people, whether it's Chaz Bono or Laverne Cox or Caitlyn Jenner. I guess.
And I feel like society's default idea, when you say like transgender person, they think of a white trans woman. Maybe not quite so much anymore because of Laverne Cox, but I feel like generally speaking, like when people think of that, like, I mean, there are people who don't even realize that trans men exist, let alone non-binary people.
Definitely. This whole time we live in a society where there are two options, and it kind of blows people's mind that there could be infinite options. So it's just like, I mean, I think almost everyone would agree that being binary transgender is a thing. It exists, whether or not they think that it's a good thing or a helpful thing, or whether people who are binary transgender are, you know, mentally ill or have problems, or whether they think that's how they were born. I think 99.9% of people who have heard of this concept agree that it's a thing. Whereas there are lots of people out there who have heard of non-binary identity who think that it's just fake. It just doesn't exist. So
I've seen memes that, like, you know, that like it's just totally a made up thing. Like people do it for attention, and that, you know, it's
snowflake.
Yeah,
exactly. People do it because they want to be different. They want to be special. And of course, like, people who say that are people who have never navigated society as a person like that to experience that, to say like trust me, nobody would choose this.
Yeah. And even if it is a choice, none of your business.
Well, right. which is why I try to avoid that argument in the first place, because even if it was a choice, who cares? but it's still a ridiculous assertion to make. Like, I mean, just rolling down the scale of, social disdain, like, why would I choose to be, why would I choose to identify myself as a thing that most people dismiss the existence of? like let's not even, like, we haven't even gotten to hate yet, because you have to acknowledge something exists before you hate it. And I think in some ways that's almost worse, because, well, here's a question that I thought of, and this may run up against boundaries, and that's okay. Just stop me. But when it comes to medical care, specifically transition related medical care, whatever medical care it is that you feel that you need to pursue, Ari, you talked for example, you've been on T for about a month now. I have heard of folks who, when they tell their doctors that they're genderqueer or that they're non-binary, their doctors won't give them hormones. Because in the doctor's mind, that means that they're unsure of who they really are.
Right.
Has that been a thing that you've experienced at all?
Not for me, but that is because I purposefully sought out resources that I knew would be accepting and not mean to me about it.
Right.
I live in central Illinois, a few hours away from Chicago, so I've been very, very lucky to be able to go to the Howard Brown Health Center, which is internationally renowned as one of the premier LGBT focusing clinics in the world. And they have been nothing but amazing to me. They never asked me any invasive questions whatsoever. They pretty much just asked me, how can we help you? Let's take your medical history. Let's make sure that this is something that's healthy for you to do. Let's help you figure out your dosage and make sure that your blood work is coming back okay. You're not having any side effects. And apart from that, it's your decision.
What a novel concept.
Yeah, it is. Wow. It is amazing. There are so few places like that in the U.S. especially. There are, horror stories of people going to their GP or to an endocrinologist, and they say, oh, well, you have to go to therapy for, 3 to 6 months and then get a note from your therapist saying that this is okay for you to do and that you're not like depressed or mentally ill and none of that is contributing to your wanting to transition. So there's so much gatekeeping that goes on. It's really refreshing to be able to, go someplace where they don't engage in that. And I haven't been anywhere else. Like, I need to have other exams done at other places as well. So it'll be interesting to see how to navigate that now that, I've been taking testosterone for a while and some changes have happened to my body. And, people get refused care, even non-transition related care, just because they're like, I don't know how to deal with you. What's going on with you? But I've been very, very privileged in that area, and there's definitely a need for more, they call it informed consent, whereas, right. The previous model for transition related care was you have to go to therapy and you have to get notes from all these doctors and all this stuff. But there are now places that are operating on an informed consent model where they give you basically a form that lists all the risks and benefits and you sign, and, there you go. As long as it's medically healthy for you, you can do whatever you see fit with your body.
Right, which, makes sense because, we acknowledge that trans healthcare is no different than any other healthcare, aside from maybe it's needed by a unique population, but, in terms of its importance and its legitimacy, it's no different. And, if you go to a cold, if you have a cold and you go to a doctor, what do? You tell the doctor what your symptoms are, and they say, oh, okay, here's what we're going to do to fix that. They don't like, well, here, let's do all of these invasive questions and ask you about your sex life to treat your cold. But that does happen to trans people. I have a friend who actually went to a doctor for a sinus infection and was quizzed about his sex life because he was trans. Mm-hmm. And that stuff happens all the time. And and I wonder what that dynamic is like for surgeries as well. And obviously this is not anything that you have to talk about if you're not comfortable, but I wonder if there are surgeons who gatekeep in that way too, because as far as I know, anyone who does surgery requires letters from therapists. And I guess if you don't have a super culturally competent therapist who is, at least going to kind of smile and wink at the system.
Or if you can't afford to go to therapy.
Right, because many of us
problem.
can't. Yeah. So that's gatekeeping on top of gatekeeping.
Exactly.
That's disgusting. Trav, do you have any experience to relate, or that you feel comfortable relating in that area?
Well, actually, not with transitioning, because at this point I don't really feel the need to take hormones. I might, just to give myself a more androgynous look, like Ari said, but actually, I don't really have a lot of... Even when going to like a physical doctor, you know what? Actually, I don't think I even told my physician that I'm non-binary. I kind of realized there wasn't really any real reason to bring it up. Maybe I will eventually.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I guess if you're not pursuing a physical transition, there's really no reason that your doctor needs to know about it.
Right.
I guess that makes sense. Well, I'm glad that you don't have any bad experiences to report. Like, that makes me very happy. And I, for the most part, don't really have any bad experiences to report either. Even with the binary side of things, which can be pretty horrifying on its own. This has been a really awesome discussion, my friends. I really, really appreciate the perspective and being open and being honest, because as we know, that is what I am all about. So, Trav, real quick, why don't you go ahead and plug your show for the third time in a row? You're getting the Cali bump here.
Sure. Just go to www.byanymeans.com, and that's by spelled B-I, and there you can read my blog and also listen to the podcast, and there are also links to iTunes and Stitcher.
All right, and Ari?
I don't have a podcast still. I probably will never.
You still don't have a podcast. Yeah. An hour after I asked you the last time, you still don't have a podcast. What are you doing with your life?
You can friend me on Facebook. I'm Ari Coleman. I'm happy to be friends with you and talk to you about anything you want, whether it's non-binary stuff, atheist stuff, any kind of stuff. Be my friend.
And I would recommend you be Ari's friend as well, as I did in the last episode. And that, my friends, is going to do it for this episode of the Gaytheist Manifesto on Secular Media Network. I again want to thank my guests, Ari and Trav. You can find the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Gaytheist Manifesto. You can email us at thegaytheistmanifesto@gmail.com. I'm on Twitter at GaytheistCali, and you can find the show on Twitter at The Gaytheist. If you want to support the show, support the activism that I do, you can head to patreon.com/The Gaytheist Manifesto to make a per episode contribution. And if financial compensation, or if financial support isn't a thing that you can do, that's totally okay. You can go to iTunes and you can leave us a 5-star review. That is also a huge, huge help. Before we go, I want you to know that if you're lost, you're hurting, you're scared, if you feel like no one cares and no one understands, you need to know there's a community out here that loves you, cares for you, knows that you're capable of amazing things and that you are worthy of love. If you're struggling, please don't be afraid to reach out. Until next time, friends, this is the Gaytheist Manifesto.